Welcome to this webinar where we will consider the use of employee benefits for South Africans working abroad post-2020. When I refer to employee benefits, I'm making specific reference to international pension schemes. As part of these considerations, we will look at the types of employer and employee relationships that exist. We will also look at the types of pension arrangements which can be used within the employee benefit space, some of the tax considerations, and also some of the broader advantages that international pensions provide to the employees. Before you continue with this webcast, please ensure that you have read the two documents which you can now see on the screen in front of you. These documents provide an awful lot of content-rich information, specifically relating to the topic that we are discussing. You can access this information if you visit otap2020taxchanges.com and navigate to the resource page where you'll be able to download this information. When considering the employee-employer relationship, there are three models. Basic model is one that's very common to all of us, and that is where you have an individual employed by a company on a permanent contract. From a South African perspective, these are typically individuals who live and work abroad, but they have an intention to return to South Africa at some point in time in the future, and therefore they are ordinarily resident for tax purposes and will be affected by the 2020 changes. In addition, we have the instance where the individual is employed by an agency, and that agency in turn provides human resources to foreign companies. The main difference here is that these are short-term contracts, often 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year, possibly even out as 5 years, but generally never longer than that. The key point being it's the agency that employs the individual and not the company. These individuals are typically transient migrant workers who will spend on average 6 months, maybe a little bit longer, a year outside of South Africa, but always return because their families and place of economic interests ultimately remain in South Africa. Lastly, we have your experienced senior professional people who might have left employment, have set up their own consultancy practices. These are companies that they've established specifically to go out and provide consultancy services to companies. They will have multiple companies as clients, but their point of contract is going to be with the consultancy company, who in turn provides services to corporates. The point to take away from these models is to consider who is the employer, who's providing the employment contract within these different relationships, because it's at that point where the employee benefit will be offered from. If we move to considering the types of employee benefit that can be provided under a pension, we have two types. The first type is your contractual obligation to provide retirement as a company, which is a non-contributory arrangement. There's no requirement on the individual employee to provide any funding for this. These arrangements are typically referred to as occupational pensions, and the company takes on the responsibility for providing the scheme. It takes on the responsibility for the costs of the scheme, and it also takes on the responsibility for the ultimate provision of retirement benefits. It takes on all the risk and all the cost. In return for that, the employer will generally have a reduction in their earnings as a quid pro quo for what the company is providing on the other side. These are often referred to as salary give up or salary sacrifice arrangements, where you will quite happily have a contractual relationship with your company where you might earn less, and the company having an onus on the other side to provide these kind of employee benefits for at end of service. From a product perspective, Overseas Trust and Pension, we provide occupational pension schemes very much in this space to many multinational firms around the world, and it is done through a product which we call Elements, which is an occupational scheme. The companies will subscribe to the scheme, and the employees will become member of the scheme. The other alternative is where an employer will have a contractual obligation to fund a pension scheme for and on behalf of the member. A very different contractual obligation. The commonality being that it is the employer's responsibility to make provision, albeit in option 2, it is done in a very, very different way. It's typically done with the employer making a contribution into a personal pension scheme for that individual, and it will be done through payroll. Members' income will come in, the contribution to pension will come in, and then it'll be deducted and paid to the pension scheme by the employer. This doesn't result in a reduction of the individual's income, as a salary sacrifice arrangement would exist. And this will have a bearing on income tax, as obviously you're going to be taxed on the amount of income that you actually earn. So under this arrangement, you'll have your OPIS plan, which is your personal international retirement plan, being funded by the company under the contractual obligation to fund a pension, but deducted from payroll. So those are your two types of arrangements. They're quite different in terms of the contractual obligations, but they ultimately end up at the same point, that at retirement, the member has accumulated funds, or there's a benefit for the provision of retirement. Now, if we take a look at some of the implications around receiving benefits from an international pension scheme, which has been put in place as an employee benefit, we can look at the perspective of both personal and occupational schemes as one. The important point to note here is that under current tax legislation in South Africa, there is an exemption on foreign pension income being paid into South Africa. However, to qualify for that exemption, there are certain conditions which must be met. First of all, the arrangement that is paying this income must be a bona fide pension scheme. What is a bona fide pension scheme? Well, it needs to be a pension that is established under the relevant legislation in a foreign country. It must be a pension in the country that it is set up, first and foremost, and its purpose must be for retirement. Secondly, the services rendered must be outside of South Africa. In those examples we looked at, those 3 different models, in all of those models, these were individuals working for a company where the company was outside of South Africa, and the services they were providing was from outside of South Africa. So services rendered outside of South Africa. And lastly, the source of the foreign pension cannot be South African, so foreign source. So again, company A based in Kenya, providing a pension contribution to its employee, the source is the Kenyan company, and the services are services rendered in Kenya, and the pension scheme happens to be a Guernsey pension. It's all foreign source, so your pension is foreign source, the services rendered and the contribution are all foreign source. It's very clear that these are effectively all components that are happening outside of South Africa. And if those conditions are met, the exemption on foreign pension income applies. Why do we have such an exemption available? Well, you need to put this into context with domestic schemes. If I was a resident living in South Africa, I was making contributions, or my company was making a contribution to a personal pension scheme on my behalf, I would get tax relief on my contributions. So tax relief on the way in, but I would pay tax on the way out. With your international schemes, for your ordinarily residents, they don't have the benefit of tax relief on the way in. They are fully taxed on their earnings, and the income tax relief, however, is available on the way out, where they get an exemption. Domestics, tax relief on the way in, taxed on the way out. Internationals, no tax relief on the way in, but tax relief on the way out. So an absolute inverse of the two. So that's the bit of legislation which actually makes pension provision from an international perspective very, very attractive. And it is one of those bits of legislation specifically to incentivize people to save for retirement and not be a burden on the state and they return to South Africa. In summary, irrespective of which type of employee benefit arrangement is in place, asset protection comes into play. You cannot afford to lose your pension that you've accumulated over your life. You just can't afford to do it. These pensions give you legislative protection in respect of those assets. Investment in currency freedom, there are no constraints or typically very few constraints on the nature of the underlying investments and the currency that you choose to invest in or indeed have benefits paid in. As with your domestic arrangements, the growth in these structures is not subject to taxation. And of course, when you get your income from a foreign pension, provided it met the rules, you have an exempt income in retirement, albeit you didn't get any tax relief. Flexible benefit options, multiple options available to individuals, lump sums, drawdowns, annuities, they're all available under these arrangements. The point being that people can arrange their income in a way that meets their requirements when back in South Africa. Excellent succession options, very similar to a domestic pension in South Africa, in that those contributions made by the company are not subject to estate duty. Additional voluntary contributions by the member might be, but your company contributions are not part of the, don't form part of your estate. And the succession of these assets is very straightforward. There's no need for wills, both domestic or foreign wills, and the pension benefits will move across typically to the spouse in a seamless way without the burden of the probate and estate process. So very, very useful vehicles for succession planning, which really bears the same characteristics as you would see with a domestic pension scheme in South Africa. And lastly, robust, well-regulated, well-structured vehicles to accumulate your retirement provision in. Contractual obligations is an important point. Both of these arrangements require contractual obligations to be taken on by the employer. So therefore, a willing employer is required in order to undertake contributions of these natures or funding or provision of these natures. Yes, it might require the individual to sacrifice their income. A lot of expats are used to having a high income, and if they want to achieve some of the benefits available through certain of the arrangements we looked at, they will have to sacrifice their income, or they may have to sacrifice that income. Importantly, these arrangements need to have specialist professional advice that sits alongside the financial planning advice that you're going to be providing as an advisor. I'm talking about professional accountancy and or tax advice to ensure that the contractual arrangements are structured in accordance with the legislation in South Africa to ensure that the benefits that are expected to flow do flow through to the individuals. And ultimately, as a company, we offer both personal schemes under Opus and corporate schemes under Elements in order to accumulate those accruals, those contributions or contractual requirements for pensions under both corporate and personal schemes. That brings us to the end, where I would say read the materials that we publish. Whilst they are not advice, they do provide a good overall insight into the topics generally. Start the conversation with your clients and with the employer to discuss how you might be able to help normalize these people's contracts, these expat contracts. Many of them are on cash-only arrangements. Those are unbalanced. They're not normal arrangements, and people are missing out all the benefits that can be provided from the advantages that you get from pension arrangements. It's about normalizing people's affairs, rebalancing their packages. Determine is what is possible. once you've undertaken these steps, you'll understand what is the art of the possible in respect of that client and the company they might be working for, be it a long-term employer or an agency. And once you understand that position, if there's scope to introduce employee benefits, then get specialist advice. Don't get the specialist advice in advance of that. Make sure you've got all of your ducks in a row before you go out and get specialist advice. That specialist advice does cost money, but it's cost well worth paying for to ensure one gets the right outcome for clients. Now, with respect to that, we will be providing the names of 2 firms which do specialize in cross-border employee benefits and taxation, and they will be able to guide you, your client, and their employer through the different options to ensure that the right outcome is achieved or a suitable outcome is achieved. But it does require that willing employer for those conversations to be instigated, and they are professional services, so there is a cost associated with those. I hope this has given you more of an overview of how international pensions can be used as an employee benefit and some of the implications it will have for your clients if their companies allow them to take up such benefits. Thank you.